All right, picking up from the last video, we were talking about the U.S. Capital markets and left off right here on venture capital markets. So the U.S. does have a pretty good venture capital market. This is where high-risk stocks are traded, and venture capitalists are investors that prefer these high-risk stocks. Oftentimes, these businesses are in new innovation, technology, IT, that type of stuff, because even though there is a high risk associated with these, most new innovations fail. They yield zero long-term profits. The ones that make it tend to make it big. And you have to have an environment that is fertile for venture capital to really spawn innovation. And pretty much every country, every major country in the world today has capital markets where people channel savings to investment for many businesses, but not all countries have venture capital markets. That is, not all countries are able to generate the capital necessary to actually create new ideas. And the US does a pretty good job of that. Another thing we want to talk about is regulation. So regulation in the US is ever present, from the lowest level of business all the way to the highest. But there are some unique characteristics in the US that may differ from other countries. We have, for example, a contract clause in the Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. And the contract clause says that you cannot have laws that impair the obligation of contracts. So a contract is an agreement between two parties for some future transaction. And by having a contract clause, you're limiting the government's ability to nullify contracts entered into by individual citizens. You are effectively raising the integrity of the contractual structure. You're creating an environment that is going to be much more likely to enter into contracts, because when people sign a contract, they know the other party has to come through, and the other party is not going to get out of that through some government decree or decision. Another aspect of regulation is due process and just compensation clause, part of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Underneath this, we see eminent domain. This is the government's right to seize property. So in the US, the government can take property from private individuals, but they can only do it for the public interest. So it has to be kind of a larger common good in order to justify confiscation of property. Take a look at these two court cases here. These cases are going to help us understand how a regulatory environment in the US has expanded over time. Now, I want to be clear, there's many court cases that have expanded the role of government, but these are two big ones that are worth noting. Also, keep in mind that even though the US has a less regulatory environment than many other countries, we still have a lot more regulation today than we did, say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 200 years ago. In other words, regulation has grown with our economy. So the first of these two cases is Moon versus Illinois in 1877. This is where the Supreme Court ruled that states could regulate private industry if the industry affected the common good. So, this idea that the state could get involved in how businesses are run and in the types of things that businesses could and couldn't do, that was not common until we get to this Supreme Court ruling. And when you start to talk about regulating private industry that affects the common good, well, what's the common good? I mean, just about every business affects the common good. So it really opened up the door for state expansion in regulation. And then you have Kelo versus the City of New London, Connecticut in 2005. This is where the Supreme Court ruled that a city could seize private property for commercial development in a distressed area and for economic rejuvenation. Very controversial, because eminent domain typically applied to the government seizing property for the public interest. So they might take someone's house, for example, pay them market value, but they took the house because they were going to, build a freeway through that area, and the house was in the way. So it was clearly a public interest for a freeway or for any major public works project. With Kelo versus New London, you're saying that the government can take property for the public interest to benefit private interests. They could seize private property for commercial development. And a good example of this is where these cities will want to build a sports stadium. So they'll confiscate the property of private owners in that particular area, and then they'll turn around and sell it, or in some cases even give it to private commercial developers to build a stadium. So that's very controversial because it feels a little bit questionable when you're just moving property, private property, from one party to another and using the public interest as a justification. Today, there's a multitude of state and over 30 national regulatory agencies. So this movement towards more regulation, despite the contract clause and due process and just compensation clause in the Constitution, there has been an advancement in regulation, but maybe not as much as some other countries that didn't have these kinds of constitutional protections against government overreach. The Federal Register, if you click on this link, it will take you to a publication that's updated daily that shows all new federal regulations, amendments, and proposals. Typically, there's hundreds of updates on a daily basis to give you a sense of just how big the federal government is. And then the Code of Federal Regulations, this is officially known as the Code, and it is every regulation in effect. Okay, the most recent count we have was back in 1998. They counted the pages, and it was 134,723 pages, 201 volumes, claiming 19 foot of shelf space. I don't know if they've done a count since then. It's a moot point. It's large. That's all we need to know. And so even the smaller governments still have a lot of regulation. Okay, you can see the regulatory environment has changed over time, and believe it or not, there have been periods of deregulation. This is the reduction of government regulation and a return of decision-making back to private business. Deregulation can come about because if the amount of government oversight becomes so great that it undermines the productivity of the economy, or it undermines entrepreneurship and advancements in technology, then we would say it is inefficient. So we want regulation as long as it enhances productivity. We don't want regulation that is a barrier to productivity. Now, when I say we, I mean economists, so don't misunderstand. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that want more or less regulation for their own personal reasons. But from an efficiency standpoint, from the goal of getting maximum output in an economy, regulation should be subject to the same rule that we apply to all economic decision making. We should apply regulation if the benefits exceed the costs, and reduce regulation if the benefits of the reduction exceeds the costs, until we find the optimal amount of regulation, economically efficient regulation, or rational regulation. The challenge with determining the right amount of regulation is counterfactual information. Whenever we impose regulation, we see the effects after the regulation is imposed, but we don't really know what would have happened if the regulation hadn't been imposed. So this happens with even the simplest of regulation. You could say, well, we're going to raise the speed limit from, let's say, 65 to 75. Okay, well, that would be a form of kind of deregulation. So we could look at that and then see what happens. Well, let's say there's a 2% increase in traffic fatalities. Well, we know that we removed the regulation and there was an increase in fatalities, but we don't know what would have happened if we hadn't removed that regulation. So it's very hard to evaluate if regulation is good or bad, if it's efficient or inefficient, which often means that we don't address over or under regulation until there's a significant reason to. And that's exactly what happened in the late 70s. By the late 70s, it was clear that a lot of regulation was interfering with productivity. It was actually having the opposite effect that it was intended for. And so there was a large-scale movement, deregulatory movement, that began in 1978 via the Airline Deregulation Act. This Deregulation Act authorized airlines rather than the Civil Aeronautics Board to set fares and choose rates. Believe it or not, prior to this act, the government, via this Aeronautics Board was setting the fares on planes. In fact, it got so heavily regulated that there were some airlines that were being regulated as to the food they could serve and the types of comfort and seating amenities that they could provide. One of the problems was that because the government was setting standards for airlines, airlines started to compete in non-monetary ways. So if the government says, well, a flight from San Diego to Chicago is X dollars and all airlines have to charge that, then airlines trying to attract customers, they find other ways to compete. So some airlines would offer better food, some airlines would offer better comfort, and the government said, no, that's unfair, you can't do that. So it got to where the quality had diminished and people wanted a change. So we deregulated the airlines. By the way, I'm just touching on these here, but there's plenty of videos online. There's even documentaries that have talked about these major changes, especially the Airline Deregulation Act. So it might be worth taking a look at those if you're interested. 1980, there was a Motor Carrier Act. This curbed the role of the Interstate Commerce Commission in interstate trucking. Trucking has long been heavily regulated. Some of it makes total sense. I mean, having truckers document the hours they're working, having them make sure that there's a certain period of time between shifts so they're adequately rested, that type of regulation makes sense. But some of this regulation was burdensome, just like in the airline industry. And then 1980, Staggers Rail Act, this deregulated the railroads. And then in 1980, we also got the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Acts. These acts allowed banks to charge interest rates and authorize savings and loans and credit unions to offer checking accounts. Surprisingly, back in this period, prior to this period, savings and loans and credit unions could not offer checking accounts. Only commercial banks could. That put savings and loans and credit unions at a competitive disadvantage. So the government wanted to give them that discretion and at the same time increase competition in the industry. Also, banks charging any interest rates. There have been what are called usury charges at the state level in the past that cap the amount of interest that could be charged on loans. Problem with that, I mean, it sounds good. You are capping the amount of interest that people would have to pay on a loan, because when interest rates get really high, it almost feels like there's gouging going on, like the lender, the bank is taking advantage of the borrower. But if you don't let interest rates go up, then it's possible that lenders stop making loans. And so you get a kind of deficiency in loanable funds, and that can have more damaging effects than even high interest rates. Okay, so major deregulatory movements. Now, this took place in the U.S., but it wasn't just here. In the late 70s and early 80s, we also see a wave of deregulation occurring in many other countries across the world, including Europe and most notably the UK under the Margaret Thatcher administration. Let's talk about the U.S. labor markets. The U.S. is somewhat unique in the world because we do have a very flexible labor market. What that means is that we use at-will employment, where workers and employees can be fired or laid off with very few limitations placed on them by the government. Now understand, labor markets are regulated at the state and at the local level. So what you see in one area of the country might be different than another. But generally speaking, for the U.S. as a whole, this is a very flexible environment. You could hire someone, and if they don't work out, a few hours later, get rid of them. You may have to pay them when you terminate them, but you are able to remove poor performing workers through termination. And from the worker's standpoint, that may not sound good, right? It sounds like you can be fired whenever you want, whenever they want. But the advantage is the companies are more willing to take a risk on somebody when they can turn right around and get rid of them if they don't work out. Whereas if you're in a country where you have to hire someone and then keep them for a year or 5 years, then you'd be much less likely to hire someone and take a risk on them. You might only want to hire people with experience or people that have been vetted. So oftentimes these hire and fire markets, these at-will employment countries, tend to have more opportunities for people, even though there's not that certainty and that confidence that you will have your job for years in the future. Let's stop there. We'll pick up with the major regulatory movements in the next video. Thanks.